Silence. Complete, suffocating silence hangs in the humid Pacific air as 23 pairs of eyes stare through rusted barbed wire. The women stand like ghosts, bare feet planted in red clay, torn uniforms hanging from skeletal frames, faces carved hollow by months of starvation and fear. Steam rises from metal trays in the hands of American soldiers just beyond the gate, carrying the scent of hot rice and soup into the morning stillness. One woman's lips part slightly, as if to speak, but no sound comes. Her fingers tremble against the wire mesh, watching as a young GI with rolled-up sleeves approaches with careful, measured steps. Behind him, more soldiers wait with plates of food still warm from the camp kitchen. The incongruity is almost surreal. These are the same hands that held rifles just weeks ago, now offering nourishment to those they were trained to see as enemies. The gate creaks open with a metallic groan that seems to echo across decades of propaganda and hatred. Still, the women do not move. They have been told for years that American soldiers are devils, monsters who desecrate the dead and torture the living. Yet here stands a freckled boy from Iowa, barely 19, extending a bowl of soup toward a woman old enough to be his mother. Her name is Keiko Nakamura, though the Americans don't know this yet. She was once a military nurse who tended wounded soldiers on the front lines of the Pacific Theater. Now she weighs less than 90 pounds, her medical training forgotten in the fog of malnutrition and exhaustion. The bowl hovers between them, an offering that defies everything she was taught to believe about the enemy. The first drop of broth touches her lips, and something breaks inside her chest. Not her resolve, not her patriotism, but something deeper. The realization that mercy can come from the most unexpected places. Around her, other women slowly step forward, their bare feet shuffling across ground that suddenly feels less like a prison and more like the threshold between one world and another. This is the moment that will haunt both sides for the rest of their lives, not because of its violence, but because of its tenderness. In a war defined by brutality, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply offering food to someone who is hungry. To understand the magnitude of that first meal, we must journey back to the twilight of an empire, when these women still believed in the invincibility of the rising sun. Just 18 months earlier, Keiko Nakamura had stood at attention in a military hospital in Rabaul, her crisp white uniform pressed and spotless, her faith in Imperial Japan absolute and unwavering. She was not alone in this devotion. Across the Pacific Theater, thousands of Japanese women served their emperor in roles that brought them dangerously close to the front lines. They were nurses like Keiko, radio operators who transmitted coded messages through crackling static, clerks who organized supply routes, and auxiliaries who provided critical support to combat units. They shared a common belief that death was preferable to capture and that the Americans would show no mercy to prisoners of war. This belief was not born in a vacuum. The Japanese propaganda machine had spent years crafting a terrifying portrait of their enemies. In darkened movie theaters across Japan, women watched films depicting American soldiers as bloodthirsty savages who collected Japanese ears as trophies and violated prisoners before executing them. Military commanders reinforced these images with whispered stories of atrocities, each tale more horrifying than the last. "The Americans will use you for unspeakable experiments," officers warned their female personnel. "They will torture you for information, then leave you to die in agony. Better to die with honor than to endure such shame." These words were not merely propaganda. They were treated as gospel truth by women who had dedicated their lives to serving their nation. As Japan's empire began to crumble in late 1944, these beliefs took on desperate urgency. Supply lines stretched thin across vast ocean distances. Allied bombers turned Japanese-held islands into moe, on scapes of craters and ash. One by one, the outposts that had once seemed impregnable began to fall, leaving behind pockets of military personnel who suddenly found themselves isolated and forgotten. The women serving in these remote locations faced an impossible choice. Their commanders, following the samurai code of Bushido, insisted that surrender was not an option. Death before dishonor. Yet, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, capture became increasingly inevitable for those unable to escape. Keiko remembered the last radio transmission from headquarters before the communications went silent forever. The voice was calm, professional, almost bureaucratic. All personnel are expected to conduct themselves with honor. Remember your duty to the Emperor. Remember what the Americans will do to you if captured. The static that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. In hidden bunkers and abandoned hospitals, these women waited as the sound of American artillery grew closer each day. Some wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Others destroyed sensitive documents and medical supplies, ensuring they would not fall into enemy hands. All of them prepared to face a fate they believed would be worse than death itself. They could never have imagined that their greatest shock would not come from violence, but from an act of simple human kindness. The end came not with the dramatic final battle they had been promised, but with exhaustion, disease, and the slow realization that help was never coming. When American patrols finally discovered the hidden medical station where Keiko and her companions had been hiding, the scene defied every expectation on both sides. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston had been leading reconnaissance missions for 3 months, searching for Japanese holdouts in the dense jungle terrain. His unit expected to find armed resistance, booby traps, or empty bunkers stripped of anything useful. Instead, they found 23 women huddled in what had once been a field hospital, now reduced to little more than rotting canvas and rusted medical equipment. They looked like they were already dead, O'Brien would later write to his wife. Skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken so deep you could barely see them. Some were lying on the ground, too weak to stand. Others just stared at us like we were apparitions. The Americans had prepared for combat, not for a humanitarian crisis. The women's condition told the story of Japan's collapsing supply chain more eloquently than any intelligence report. They had been surviving on tree bark soup and whatever insects they could catch. Several showed signs of beriberi and scurvy. 2 were running high fevers from infected wounds that had gone untreated for weeks. They were not the fanatical fighters described in American training manuals. They were human beings on the edge of death. What struck O'Brien's medic, Corporal James Williams, was their absolute silence. In 3 years of war, I'd never encountered prisoners who wouldn't speak, he recalled decades later. Japanese soldiers would sometimes shout at us or spit or try to bite. These women just watched, like they were waiting for something terrible to happen. The silence was borrowed, and from a complex mixture of shame, terror, and disbelief. According to their training, they should have committed suicide rather than face capture, yet here they were, alive and in American hands, waiting for the torture and humiliation they had been taught to expect. The fact that the Americans seemed more concerned with their medical condition than with interrogation only deepened their confusion. Williams began triaging the most seriously ill women, using gestures and broken Japanese phrases learned from military phrasebooks. One woman, later identified as Nurse Tanaka, flinched violently when he approached with a medical bag. She had seen American soldiers before only in propaganda films, where they were depicted as sadistic monsters. Now one was trying to take her pulse and examine her wounds with the same gentle professionalism she had once shown her own patients. The cultural collision was complete when the Americans radioed for medical supplies and hot food to be brought to the site. The women watched in stunned silence as their captors began preparing not for an execution or interrogation, but for what appeared to be a meal. Steam began rising from hastily prepared rice and soup, carried through the jungle by soldiers who moved with the urgency of people responding to a humanitarian emergency. None of them, neither the Americans nor the Japanese, were prepared for what would happen next. The first spoonful was a revolution disguised as a simple meal. As Keiko lifted the metal spoon to her lips, her hands shaking from more than malnutrition, she was crossing a bridge that no propaganda had prepared her to navigate. The broth was warm against her tongue, not just physically warm, but infused with something she had forgotten existed, compassion from an unexpected source. Around her, the other women faced the same impossible moment. Nurse Tanaka, who had spent months preparing for honorable death, found herself accepting a cup of hot coffee from Corporal Williams. The bitter liquid burned going down, but it carried with it a warmth that reached beyond her empty stomach to something deeper, the recognition that she was being treated not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a human being in need of care. The American soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, but also with a gentleness that defied years of combat conditioning. Sergeant O'Brien carefully helped an elderly clerk sit upright against a fallen log before placing a bowl of rice in her trembling hands. Private First Class Johnson, barely 21 himself, noticed one woman shivering in the humid air and quietly draped his own field jacket over her shoulders. These small gestures carried enormous weight. Each act of kindness challenged the fundamental assumptions both sides had carried into this war. The women had been taught that Americans were monsters incapable of mercy. The soldiers had been trained to view all Japanese as fanatics who would fight to the death. Yet here they sat together in a jungle clearing, sharing a meal that tasted of something neither side had expected to find: basic human decency. The rice was simple, prepared quickly over field stoves with ingredients from military rations. But for women who had been surviving on bark and insects, it might as well have been a feast pre-savours, paired by the finest chefs in Tokyo. Each grain carried flavour they had almost forgotten existed. The soup, made from dehydrated vegetables and bits of canned meat, represented abundance beyond their recent dreams. More than sustenance, the meal represented a fundamental shift in power dynamics. In accepting food from their captors, the women were acknowledging their helplessness while simultaneously discovering that this vulnerability would not be exploited. The Americans, in offering nourishment before interrogation, were revealing values that transcended military necessity. Steam continued to rise from the bowls and cups scattered around the clearing, creating small clouds that seemed to carry away some of the hatred and fear that had defined this conflict. In that moment, the war felt very far away. As the initial shock of the meal began to fade, something more complex took its place, a tentative recognition of shared humanity that neither side knew how to process. Sergeant O'Brien found himself studying the face of the woman he would later learn was Keiko Nakamura. Her eyes, sunken from malnutrition, held an intelligence and dignity that challenged every stereotype he had carried about the enemy. She was studying him in return, this young American soldier with dirt under his fingernails and worry lines already etched around his eyes despite his youth. When she had imagined American soldiers, she had pictured savage beasts without conscience or culture. She had not expected to see exhaustion that mirrored her own, or the way his hands shook slightly as he poured more coffee into her cup, not from fear but from the accumulated stress of months in combat. The barriers began to crumble in unexpected ways. When Nurse Tanaka noticed that one of the younger women was struggling to hold her bowl due to weakness, Corporal Williams immediately moved to help. But before he could reach her, Tanaka had already taken the bowl, supporting the woman's head while helping her drink. The Americans watched this act of care with recognition. This was the same protective instinct they felt toward their own wounded comrades. Private Johnson produced a chocolate bar from his pack, breaking it into small pieces to share among the women. The gesture was spontaneous, born from memories of his own sister back home, who had always been too thin for her age. As he placed a square of chocolate in the palm of an elderly clerk, he saw her eyes widen with surprise. She had not tasted sugar in over a year. Yet beneath these moments of connection lay deeper currents of confusion and shame. The women carried the weight of their propaganda training. They should have chosen death over this humiliation. The fact that their captors were showing kindness rather than cruelty only deepened their moral crisis. If Americans could show mercy, what did that say about everything they had been taught about this war? The soldiers carried their own burden of cognitive dissonance. They had been trained to see Japanese civilians and military personnel as fundamentally different from themselves, people who valued honor over life, who would fight to the death rather than surrender. Yet the women before them displayed the same survival instincts, the same capacity for gratitude, the same protective care for their companions that any group of American women might show under similar circumstances. As the afternoon light filtered through the jungle canopy, casting dappled shadows across the makeshift dining area, both sides began to glimpse the possibility that the enemy they had been fighting might be more complex than either government had been willing to admit. To truly understand the magnitude of this cultural collision, we must examine the machinery of hatred that had brought both sides to this jungle clearing. The propaganda war had been fought as fiercely as any battle, with both governments investing enormous resources in convincing their people that the enemy was subhuman, incapable of mercy, and deserving of total destruction. In Japan, the campaign had been particularly intensive regarding American treatment of prisoners. Military training films showed American soldiers committing atrocities that were often fabricated or dramatically exaggerated. Women in military service received special briefings about the fate that awaited them if captured, stories designed to ensure they would choose suicide over surrender. The Americans have no concept of honor, one training manual explained. They view prisoners as objects for experimentation and entertainment. Female prisoners face fates too horrible to describe in detail. These materials were distributed with the authority of the imperial government, carrying the weight of official truth. The American propaganda machine had been equally active, though in different ways. Training materials emphasized the Japanese willingness to fight to the death, their supposed incapacity for surrender, and their alien cultural values. The Japanese mind works differently from ours, soldiers were told. They do not value individual life the same way we do. Expect fanatical resistance from all personnel, regardless of age or gender. Both narratives served military purposes. They motivated soldiers to fight harder and reduced the psychological burden of killing the enemy. But they also created a psychological framework that made the scene in the jungle clearing almost incomprehensible to those experiencing it. As Keiko slowly finished her bowl of soup, she found herself confronting the collapse of everything she had been taught to believe. The Americans around her showed no signs of the sadistic pleasure she had been told they took in tormenting prisoners. Instead, Sergeant O'Brien was carefully rationing the medical supplies his unit carried, ensuring that the sickest women received treatment first. Corporal Williams had begun a rudimentary medical examination of the women, using gentle gestures and simple words to explain what he was doing. His movements were professional, respectful, more like a doctor than a soldier. When he discovered that one woman had a badly infected wound on her leg, he immediately began cleaning and dressing it with the same care he would show to a wounded American. The cognitive dissonance was equally powerful for the Americans. These women showed none of the fanatical resistance they had been trained to expect. There were no suicide attempts, no desperate attacks with hidden weapons, no defiant speeches about the emperor. Instead, they displayed basic human responses: gratitude for food, relief at medical attention, concern for their companions' welfare. Private Johnson found himself thinking about conversations with his buddies back at base, where they had speculated about Japanese inability to feel pain or fear like normal people. The woman sitting across from him was clearly terrified, clearly suffering from malnutrition and illness, clearly relieved to be receiving help. Her humanity was impossible to deny. This meal was becoming an act of rebellion against the narrative both sides had been given about this war, and about each other. In the weeks that followed their capture, as the women recovered their strength in the American prisoner of war camp, many began to write letters they would never send. These documents, discovered years later in military archives, reveal the profound psychological impact of that first shared meal and the days that followed. Keiko Nakamura wrote to her husband, though she had no idea if he was still alive. "Dearest Hiroshi, I am alive, but I am not the woman who kissed you goodbye at the train station. I have eaten food prepared by American hands. I have accepted medicine from American doctors. They have shown me kindness when I expected torture. What does this make me? What does this make them?" The letters reveal a complex mixture of gratitude, guilt, and confusion. These women had been raised in a culture that valued honor above life, where accepting help from an enemy represented a form of spiritual contamination. Yet they could not deny the evidence of their own experience, Americans who treated them with basic human decency. Nurse Tanaka wrote to her mother, "The American medic reminds me of Kenji-kun when he was studying to become a doctor. He has the same gentle hands, the same careful way of explaining procedures. Yesterday he showed me a photograph of his wife. She is expecting their first child. How can I reconcile this tenderness with everything we were told about these people?" Some letters attempted to maintain loyalty to the emperor while acknowledging their current reality. An elderly clerk wrote, "I have not betrayed our sacred cause, but I begin to wonder if we were told the complete truth about our enemies. They sing songs in the evening that remind me of the lullabies my grandmother used to hum. Their laughter sounds like human laughter. Their tears, when they speak of fallen comrades, look like human tears." The most poignant letters were those written to the dead. Several women composed messages to husbands, brothers, and sons who had died fighting Americans earlier in the war. How could they explain that their killers were now their saviors? How could they reconcile the hatred that had motivated the war with the compassion they were experiencing in captivity? "I think often of that first meal," one woman wrote to her deceased brother. "The steam rising from the bowl looked like incense at a shrine. Perhaps the Buddha was trying to tell us something about the nature of compassion, that it can come from the most unexpected places, wearing the most unlikely faces." These letters, never mailed but carefully preserved, became testimonies to the power of human connection to transcend the boundaries of ideology and conflict. The repatriation ships that carried these women back to Japan in late 1945 were floating between two worlds, the war they had left behind and the homeland they barely recognized. As Keiko stood at the ship's rail watching the Japanese coastline grow larger, she carried within her a secret that she knew might never be safe to share. Japan had surrendered, but the cultural expectations remained unchanged. Women who had been captured by the enemy faced suspicion and shame, regardless of the circumstances. Many chose to reinvent their war experiences, creating sanitized versions that omitted any mention of American kindness or their own acceptance of help from the enemy. Keiko returned to a husband she barely recognized, living in a bombed-out city where former military personnel were viewed with suspicion by both occupation forces and their own countrymen. When he asked about her time as a prisoner, she found herself unable to speak the full truth. How could she explain that her strongest memories were not of suffering, but of an American sergeant sharing his coffee ration with her? Others faced similar silences. Nurse Tanaka returned to a medical career, but never spoke publicly about the American medic who had treated her infected wounds with such care. The elderly clerk moved in with her daughter's family and spent her remaining years writing poetry that hinted at experiences she could never fully describe. Yet the memory of that meal persisted. In quiet moments, when the weight of official history seemed too heavy to bear, these women would remember the taste of that first hot soup, the unexpected warmth in foreign eyes, the revolutionary discovery that mercy could cross any boundary. Some found small ways to honor what they had experienced. Keiko began volunteering at a local clinic, offering the same gentle care to patients that she had received from her former enemies. Tanaka made a point of treating American tourists with special kindness when they began visiting Japan in the 1960s, though she never explained her reasons to curious colleagues. The silence these women maintained was not born from shame about their own actions, but from a recognition that their society was not ready to hear about the complexity of human nature revealed in war's aftermath. 60 years later, when most of the participants in that jungle clearing had passed away, military historians began piecing together the story from scattered documents, brief memoir passages, and recorded interviews. What emerged was not a tale of military strategy or political significance, but something quieter and more profound, a testament to the stubborn persistence of human decency, even in war's darkest moments. Sergeant O'Brien, interviewed shortly before his death in 2003, remembered the meal with startling clarity. "I can still see the steam rising from those bowls. Funny thing about war, you remember the explosions and the shooting, but sometimes it's the quiet moments that stay with you longest. Those women looked at us like we were something impossible. Maybe we were." The clearing where they shared that first meal has long since been reclaimed by jungle growth. No monument marks the spot where American soldiers served hot soup to Japanese prisoners of war. No plaque commemorates the moment when propaganda gave way to basic human compassion. Perhaps that's as it should be. Some of history's most important moments happen without fanfare, witnessed only by those who lived them. In our age of documented everything, it's worth remembering that the most transformative acts often leave little trace. A bowl of soup shared between enemies, a jacket draped over shivering shoulders, a chocolate bar broken into careful pieces, steam rising in humid air, carrying with it the possibility that even in war, mercy can find a way. The women who experienced that unexpected kindness carried its memory for the rest of their lives, mostly in silence. But silence does not mean forgetting. Sometimes the most powerful truths are those we hold closest to our hearts, too precious and too complex for words. In a war built on hate, mercy became rebellion, and sometimes rebellion tastes like hot soup on an empty stomach.